The table was full of food and laughter, but not for me. My son-in-law leaned toward his friends, mocking me in French. He thought it was their private joke. But I understood every word. He didn't know that I had lived in France for 10 years. Every word burned, but I kept eating in silence. Days later, an envelope arrived in his hands. Plain, ordinary on the outside. When he opened it, his face turned pale, and his laughter was gone forever. If you want to know how I filled that prescription, please keep listening, and consider subscribing. The air in my son-in-law's penthouse was as thin and cold as the view was spectacular. 40 floors above the city, the world was reduced to a silent, glittering carpet of lights framed by immense panes of glass. The entire space felt less like a home and more like a high-end showroom, curated with an eye for price tags rather than comfort. In one corner, a monstrous sculpture of twisted, polished metal dominated the room, a piece Caleb, my son-in-law, often referred to as his centerpiece investment. To me, it looked like a car wreck, expensive and soulless. It was a gilded cage, and my daughter, Eliza, was its most beautiful and most trapped inhabitant. The only sound was the whisper of the climate control and the distant hum of the city, a sterile sanctuary floating above the real world. Eliza tried her best to make the evening feel warm, but you can't light a fire in a vacuum. She fluttered around the marble island in the kitchen, her smile a little too bright, her movements a little too quick. She looked stunning in a simple blue dress, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Caleb presided over the dinner table like a king, flanked by his 2 lieutenants, Declan and Julian. They were sharper-edged versions of Caleb, all wearing dark, tailored suits that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. They talked about portfolios and mergers, a language as foreign to me as ancient Greek. I just nodded, focused on the artfully arranged piece of sea bass on my plate, a portion so small it seemed more a suggestion than a meal. Then the shift happened. It was subtle. Caleb leaned toward Declan, a smirk on his lips, and murmured something in French. Declan chuckled, a short, sharp sound, and replied in kind. Julian joined in, his gaze flicking toward me for a fraction of a second. They had built a wall of language around themselves, confident in its impenetrability. They thought it was their private club, and I was just the dusty old relic they had to tolerate for Eliza's sake. My daughter shot a questioning look at her husband, sensing the change in atmosphere. Caleb simply reached over and patted her hand, a gesture meant to be reassuring, but that came across as deeply dismissive. She subsided, and their secret conversation continued around us. Every word landed like a physical blow. In French, they called me the hick. I heard Declan use the term to describe my flannel shirt. Caleb followed with a comment about my peasant hands, sneering in the language they thought I could not understand, mocking the very hands that had built the house Eliza grew up in. A slow, hot anger began to build in my chest, an old furnace rumbling to life. I didn't let it show. I kept my expression neutral, my movements deliberate. They had no idea that those hands had also spent a decade learning the craft of antique furniture restoration in a dusty workshop in Lyon, where the air was thick with the smell of wood polish and the sound of French radio. They didn't know the language they were using as a weapon was as familiar to me as the grain of oak. The drive home was a relief, a slow descent from the sterile heights of the city. My small bungalow, shared with my late wife for over 30 years, felt like a sanctuary. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar scent of sawdust, old books, and brewing coffee wrapped around me. It was the smell of a life, not a lifestyle. I went to the back study, where a large, hand-carved wooden chest sat against the wall. I knelt before it, my knees cracking, and ran my hand over the lid. The brass hinges groaned as I lifted the heavy top, releasing a scent of cedar and thyme. I sifted through the contents, my fingers brushing against objects that held more value than anything in Caleb's cold penthouse. There was a worn copy of Albert Camus's The Stranger, its pages soft and yellowed. Beneath it, a stack of old black and white photographs of my wife and me in Paris, young and impossibly happy by the River Seine. Her smile in those pictures was real, a brilliant, uncontainable thing, not the carefully managed expression my daughter now wore. At the very bottom, nestled in faded black velvet, was a small, heavy object. I picked it up. It was my Legion of Honor, the highest decoration of France, awarded for an act of courage from a lifetime ago. A chapter of my story I had never shared. It was a reminder of a man who understood honor and sacrifice, concepts utterly alien to my son-in-law. He saw a simple old man. He had no idea. The quiet anger from dinner had cooled, hardened, and settled deep in my bones. It had become resolved. And in the silence of my home, the sound of his condescending laughter echoed in my mind. 3 days passed in calculated silence. I let the sting of Caleb's insults fade, allowing the cold resolve to take its place. On a bright Tuesday morning, I called my daughter, my voice light. I told her I'd be in her part of town, and remembered she'd mentioned a wobbly bookshelf. It was a perfect excuse, a Trojan horse of fatherly duty. She sounded delighted, her voice a little too eager, betraying a loneliness that twisted my heart. The thought of her in that sterile museum, waiting for her husband to grace her with his presence, only strengthened my purpose. A good plan, I knew, was always built on a foundation of truth. The drive into the city's financial district was like entering another country entirely. The familiar maple trees and cracked sidewalks of my neighborhood gradually gave way to wider streets lined with parking meters that cost $12 an hour. The air changed, too, growing thicker with exhaust fumes and the peculiar mixture of expensive perfume and street vendor hot dogs. The buildings grew taller with each block, until they blocked out most of the sky, leaving only narrow strips of blue visible between the towers. Caleb's building rose 42 stories into that diminished sky, its glass facade reflecting the afternoon sun in blinding sheets that made me squint even behind sunglasses. It was a monument to aggressive, modern wealth that seemed to sneer at the older limestone and brick structures around it, buildings that had stood for a century while this newcomer thrust itself skyward with chrome and steel arrogance. The lobby hit me with a wave of refrigerated air that smelled of fresh lilies and floor polish. My work boots squeaked against marble floors so highly polished they reflected the crystal chandelier overhead like a dark mirror. A security guard in a pressed uniform watched me sign in at the visitor's desk, his eyes lingering on my worn canvas tool bag with subtle suspicion. The elevator was all brushed steel and soft classical music, rising so smoothly I barely felt the movement, except for the pressure in my ears. Eliza greeted me at the door with a hug that felt both grateful and desperate, her thin arms wrapping around me tighter than usual. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her 3 weeks ago, her collarbones sharp beneath the silk of her blouse. In the stark light of midday streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, the apartment seemed even more lifeless than during my previous visits. The sunlight brought no warmth to the space, only highlighting the coldness of the Italian marble floors that stretched endlessly in every direction, and the impersonal sheen of the metal sculpture that dominated the entryway like some modern god. The sculpture cast angular shadows that moved across the walls as clouds passed outside. It was a home designed to be photographed for architectural magazines, not lived in by people who ate breakfast in their pajamas or left coffee rings on tables. Eliza led me through the apartment to the home office, her heels clicking a lonely rhythm against the marble. The office was clearly Caleb's territory, every surface bearing his mark of calculated success. It was dominated by a massive desk of dark, polished mahogany that reflected the monitor's glow like black water. The desk faced a wall of 6 monitors displaying stock tickers and market graphs that shifted constantly in green and red cascades. The leather chair behind it probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. As I opened my old canvas tool bag, releasing the honest scent of machine oil and wood shavings into the sterile air like a brief, organic protest against all this perfection, she hovered near the doorway. Her fingers twisted her wedding ring nervously, a new habit I'd noticed developing over recent months. She chattered about a charity luncheon she was organizing for next month. Something about endangered butterflies that needed protection, filling the silence with a nervous energy that was painful to watch. Her voice had a brittle quality, like she was afraid of what might emerge if she stopped talking. I made a show of examining the built-in shelf, running my calloused hands along the smooth walnut joints and tightening a few loose brackets that didn't actually need adjustment. The wood felt warm compared to everything else in this cold space. My real work, however, was scanning the room with practiced eyes, taking in every detail like a detective at a crime scene, searching for a loose thread in the perfect tapestry Caleb had woven around himself. There had to be something here that would reveal the truth beneath the polish. It was then that I saw it hanging on the wall opposite the desk, or rather, what wasn't there anymore. On the wall opposite the desk hung a large, vibrant abstract painting, but it was the wrong one entirely. My hand froze on the bracket I was pretending to adjust. The wall was supposed to hold a specific piece that I knew as intimately as my own reflection, an oil painting by a 1950s artist whose work had exploded in value over the past decade. It had been my wife's most prized possession, bought during our honeymoon in Paris 35 years ago. She'd stood in that small left bank gallery for nearly an hour, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the swirling canvas of deep blues and fiery oranges that she said was like looking at hope itself, like seeing our future together made visible in paint. She had left it to Eliza in her will, specifically and deliberately, writing a note about how she wanted her daughter to have something beautiful from her mother's life before illness took everything else. The painting hanging there now was a competent but soulless imitation, a high-quality print that captured the colors but none of the texture, none of the raised brushstrokes you could feel with your fingers. It was a ghost, wearing the clothes of something living, a placeholder where a memory should have been breathing on that wall. I kept my back to her, feigning concentration on the shelf, while my mind raced through possibilities. The muscles in my jaw clenched involuntarily. I took a deep breath of the leather-scented air before turning around, forcing my features into a casual smile that felt like wearing a mask made of concrete. "That's new," I said, gesturing with my chin toward the wall, keeping my voice light and curious. "I don't think I've seen that one before." My daughter's face lit up with a genuine smile that made the deception even crueler. "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Caleb had it all arranged last month. He said it was time Mom's painting was seen by a wider audience, so he loaned it for a special exhibition out of state. Some museum in Boston is doing a retrospective on post-war abstract expressionism. He's making sure Mom's taste is recognized by the art world finally." She clasped her hands together, beaming with pride for her husband's supposed thoughtfulness. The story was perfect in its construction, polished smooth, and delivered with the sincere belief of someone who wanted desperately for it to be true. I finished my work on the bookshelf, my movements mechanical while my thoughts churned. My mind, however, was racing through the implications. An exhibition at any legitimate museum would require extensive documentation. A prestigious loan would have involved paperwork, insurance valuations worth hundreds of thousands, legal agreements that needed multiple signatures. I would have been required to sign off on any loan as co-executor of my wife's estate. No such papers had ever crossed my desk, not even a casual email. Caleb was also a man who craved the spotlight like plants craved water. If he had orchestrated such a loan to a major museum, there would have been a press release, a feature in the society pages he loved so much, photographs of him at the opening. It was a lie wrapped in plausibility. A well-constructed, plausible lie designed to explain an absence, but a lie nonetheless. I packed my tools with deliberate care, thanked my daughter for the coffee she'd offered, but I hadn't touched, and gave her a hug that lasted a moment longer than usual, the paternal gesture a mask for the cold fury churning within me like a gathering storm. Back in the familiar quiet of my study that evening, with streetlight filtering through Venetian blinds and creating bars of light across my desk, the real work began. The first crack appeared not in glossy magazines, but in the dull, text-heavy databases of public records. I searched for business licenses and liens. I found it late in the evening, a uniform commercial code filing. Caleb's company had taken out a substantial business loan, a figure in the high 7 digits, just over 6 months ago. That in itself wasn't a red flag. The red flag was the collateral listed to secure the loan. It wasn't company real estate or inventory. It was a list of fine art and collectibles, valued at an absurdly high figure. A life built on debt is a house of cards, and a strong wind was starting to blow. The loan document gave me a date, early March, but no specific transaction details beyond the vague notation of secured lending arrangement. My search for the painting's actual location hit wall after wall of digital dead ends. For 2 days, I found nothing but corporate facades and misleading paper trails, a growing frustration that settled as a dull ache behind my eyes, throbbing with each failed search. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, tasting bitter and stale when I absently took a sip. My study had become a war room, papers spread across every surface, laptop screens glowing in the dim light of my desk lamp. I was about to give up for the night, my eyes burning from staring at screens, when I remembered an article I had read about a massive data breach from a financial services company a year prior. The breach had exposed millions of transaction records, credit card numbers, and purchase histories. It was a long shot that bordered on desperate, but desperation had its own logic. I found my way to a searchable archive of the leaked data, navigating through proxy servers and encrypted connections to reach a murky corner of the internet where privacy went to die. The website had no fancy design, just raw data presented in simple text fields against a black background. I entered Caleb's corporate credit card number, which I'd memorized from the loan documents, and began to sift through a mountain of ordinary expenses that painted a portrait of excess. There were $1,000 restaurant bills, first-class flights to conferences he probably skipped, bottles of wine that cost more than most people's rent. Then, buried between a charge for dry cleaning and a payment to a luxury car service, it appeared like a confession hidden in plain sight. A single transaction from March 5th, 3 days after the loan document date. The vendor was not a gallery or a museum, as I'd expected. It was a place called the Gilded Lion. The name meant nothing to me initially. A quick search through several browsers revealed its true nature, hidden behind euphemistic descriptions and careful marketing language. It was the most exclusive, high-end pawn shop on the East Coast, a place where desperate wealthy people could quietly liquidate assets without the shame of public auction. The 3-hour drive to the neighboring state began before dawn, the dashboard clock reading 4:45 as I backed out of my driveway. The sky was a bruised purple bleeding into black, with stars still visible, but fading as the horizon began to lighten. My old sedan's engine hummed steadily as I merged onto the empty highway, its familiar vibration almost comforting after the sleepless night of research. The leather steering wheel was worn smooth under my hands from 20 years of driving. I wasn't nervous or excited. Those emotions had burned away during the long hours of investigation. The hot rage from the dinner party had cooled and crystallized into something far more dangerous, a cold, methodical purpose that sat in my chest like a block of ice. I was a craftsman on his way to a job that required precision and patience. The radio played classical music softly, violin notes floating through the car like ghosts. The sun rose gradually as I drove east, first painting the clouds pink and orange, then flooding the highway with golden light that made me flip down the visor. I stopped once for gas and black coffee at a rest stop that smelled of industrial cleaning products and stale donuts. The coffee was terrible but hot, scalding my tongue in a way that kept me alert. Other travelers moved around me like shadows, truckers stretching their backs, families heading to vacation destinations, none of them knowing they were sharing space with a man on a mission of calculated vengeance. The Gilded Lion sat on a quiet, cobblestoned street in the historic district, surrounded by antique shops and law offices housed in restored colonial buildings. Its facade was deliberately discreet, designed to blend into the respectable neighborhood. The building was red brick that had aged to a deep burgundy, with window boxes full of perfectly maintained white petunias that seemed to mock the desperate transactions happening inside. A black lacquered door bore no sign except a single, polished brass lion's head that served as both knocker and announcement of what lay within. It was a place designed for men like Caleb, where financial ruin could be elegantly managed, where family heirlooms could disappear behind closed doors, hidden from prying eyes and social judgment. I pushed open the heavy door, which moved on well-oiled hinges without a sound. A small bell chimed softly as I entered, the sound silver and delicate in the hushed interior. The air inside smelled of lemon polish and old paper, with an undertone of expensive cologne that had seeped into the very walls over years of desperate visits. The temperature was perfectly controlled, neither warm nor cool, creating an atmosphere of suspended reality. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, something by Mozart that was probably chosen for its calming effect on anxious sellers. Glass display cases lined the walls like transparent coffins, each one holding the ghosts of ruined fortunes and broken dreams. A vintage Patek Philippe watch sat on black velvet, its face catching the carefully positioned spotlights. Next to it, a first-edition novel with gilt edges that someone had probably inherited from a beloved grandparent. A set of diamond earrings sparkled with cold fire, perhaps once an anniversary gift now converted to cash to pay debts. Each item had a small card with a discreet code instead of a price, maintaining the illusion that this was something other than what it was. It was a museum of desperation dressed up as a boutique. Behind a large mahogany counter that gleamed like dark water stood a man in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal suit that had been tailored to hide his slight stoop. His thinning gray hair was combed carefully over a growing bald spot, and silver spectacles perched on a nose that had seen too much. He looked more like a university professor or a museum curator than a pawnbroker, which was certainly intentional. His expression was one of polite, professional disinterest that probably took years to perfect. His pale blue eyes moved over me in a quick assessment, taking in the worn but clean jacket, the calloused hands, the steel toe boots that had no place in his usual world. I did not fit his usual clientele of desperate investment bankers and trust fund children who'd burned through their inheritance. I approached the counter with measured steps, my boots making soft sounds on the Persian rug that covered most of the hardwood floor. I would not use tricks or deception here. I would use a carefully curated version of the truth, presented like a restored piece of furniture where the flaws had been addressed but not hidden. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a photograph of my wife's painting on the polished surface between us. The photo was slightly worn at the edges from being carried in my wallet for years. "I believe my family's painting was brought to you by mistake," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "I just want to confirm that it's safe and perhaps understand the circumstances." He glanced at the photo with the quick evaluation of someone who knew art, a flicker of professional appreciation crossing his features before the mask of indifference returned. His fingers, manicured and adorned with a simple gold signet ring, drummed once on the counter. "We have a very strict privacy policy," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, each word carefully pronounced. "Our clients trust us with their discretion." He was preparing to dismiss me with the same polite finality he'd probably used thousands of times before. I leaned forward slightly, not threateningly, but enough to show I wasn't leaving empty-handed. "I restored a Louis XIV's secretary for a client of yours, Mrs. Vanderbilt, about 5 years back. Cherry wood with gilt bronze mounts. You recommended me for the job. You said you appreciated a craftsman who understood the value of things beyond their monetary worth." The man's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring as he looked at me with renewed interest. His eyes moved from my face to the photo, and I saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. He remembered the piece, remembered me, remembered that sometimes preservation mattered more than profit. He let out a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every desperate transaction he'd overseen. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Eliza, her voice a thin, panicked thread. "Dad, what happened? Caleb came home in a terrible mood. He locked himself in his office and I heard him shouting on the phone about a painting." On the phone with Eliza, I played the part of the concerned, slightly bewildered father. I let her talk, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Caleb was furious, she explained, but also terrified. He had received some kind of mix-up in the mail, a document that made no sense, and was convinced a competitor was trying to sabotage him. She said he kept muttering about corporate espionage and how someone was trying to smear his reputation. I listened patiently, making soothing, non-committal sounds. I offered to come over, an offer I knew would be refused. Caleb's pride would never allow him to show such weakness in front of LePluc. I told her it was probably just a misunderstanding, and that things would surely look better in the morning. She seemed to take comfort in my calm, a small, sad irony that was not lost on me. I was the rock she clung to, unaware that I was the one who had summoned the storm. A week of tense silence followed. I did not push. I waited. A cornered animal is a dangerous one, and Caleb was undoubtedly scrambling, trying to understand the nature of the threat. His countermove, when it came, was both arrogant and predictable. He didn't retreat. He doubled down on the lie. Eliza called me one afternoon, her voice filled with a forced, brittle excitement. Caleb was launching a charitable foundation, she announced. The Ashford Foundation for the Arts. Its inaugural event would be a grand gala at the Fairmont Hotel in 2 weeks' time. He was going to make a major donation to the City Art Gallery, the very institution he claimed was exhibiting her mother's painting. It was a brilliant, cynical move. He was attempting to build a fortress of philanthropy around his lie, making himself appear so generous, so publicly committed to the arts, that any suggestion to the contrary would seem absurd, the ramblings of a jealous crank. And of course I was to be a guest of honor. The invitation arrived the next day, thick cream cardstock with embossed gold lettering. It felt heavy in my hand, weighted with hypocrisy. The Ashford Foundation for the Arts. The name itself was an insult, a monument to his own ego built on a foundation of deceit. But it also gave me my next target. The moment I saw the name, I knew what I had to do. A public foundation, even a private one, leaves a paper trail. It must be registered, incorporated. It must have a charter, a board of directors, a stated mission. It was another structure, and I knew how to find the weak points in a structure. I returned to my study, the faint scent of sawdust and resolve in the air, and began to dig once more. This time, I wasn't just looking for a single transaction. I was looking for the blueprint of his entire lie. My first search was through domestic nonprofit databases. I checked state and federal registries for any entity named the Ashford Foundation. I found nothing. There was no record of its existence in any public U.S. database. This was a major red flag. A legitimate charity, especially one about to host a major public gala, would have its paperwork in order. The lack of a domestic record meant one of two things. Either it was so new that the paperwork hadn't been processed, which was unlikely, or it wasn't a domestic entity at all. I broadened my search, turning to international business registries. It was like searching for a specific grain of sand on an endless beach, but I had a key piece of information to guide me. Caleb's character. He was a man who valued secrecy and the avoidance of taxes. This led me to the usual suspects: Panama, Switzerland, the Cayman Islands. It took the better part of a day, but I finally found it. The Ashford Foundation was not a charity. It was a corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a place notorious for its opaque banking laws and corporate secrecy. It was a shell, a legal fiction designed to move money around without scrutiny. The listed directors were not members of the community or art patrons. They were anonymous nominees provided by the registration agent, names that existed only on paper. The foundation's stated purpose was laughably vague, something about promoting artistic endeavors globally. It was a black hole, a financial vehicle designed to make money disappear. I printed the registration documents, the crisp pages feeling like sheets of ice in my hands. The gala wasn't a counter-move. It was a fundraising drive for himself. The night of the gala, I chose my clothes with care. I didn't wear a tuxedo. I wore my best suit, a simple, dark gray wool that I'd had for 20 years. It was well made and perfectly maintained, the kind of suit a craftsman would own. It was a quiet statement. I was not one of them, and I was not trying to be. The Fairmont Hotel's grand ballroom was a spectacle of obscene wealth. Chandeliers the size of small cars dripped crystals from the ceiling, casting a glittering golden light over the assembled crowd. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter. Men in sharp tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns drifted through the room, glasses of champagne in their hands, their laughter brittle and loud. It was a gathering of the city's elite, the very people Caleb was so desperate to impress. Eliza found me by the entrance. She looked breathtakingly beautiful in a flowing emerald green gown, but her eyes were filled with a familiar anxiety. She fussed with my tie, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so glad you came, Dad," she whispered, her voice tight. "It means so much to Caleb." I gave her a reassuring squeeze on the arm, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Caleb was holding court across the room, Declan and Julian flanking him like loyal guards. He was in his element, his smile wide, his gestures expansive. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a predator, shaking hands, clapping backs, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. He saw me and gave a magnanimous wave, the benevolent king acknowledging a humble subject. I simply nodded in return. Let him enjoy his moment. The higher he climbed, the further he would have to fall. After a dinner of meticulously arranged microscopic portions, the main event began. Caleb took to the stage, a single spotlight illuminating him against a dark velvet curtain. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice resonating with false sincerity. He talked about the power of art to elevate the human spirit. He spoke of his deep commitment to preserving the cultural heritage of the city. He announced that the Ashford Foundation was making an inaugural pledge of $100,000 to the City Art Gallery's acquisition fund. A wave of polite, enthusiastic applause rippled through the room. He was masterful, weaving a narrative of generosity and civic duty that was as beautiful and as empty as the penthouse he called home. He finished his speech and basked in the applause, his face a mask of humble pride. He then announced he would take a few questions from the audience, a move designed to showcase his transparency and expertise. This was my moment. I waited as a few softball questions were asked and answered. Then, as the event was about to conclude, I made my way to one of the microphones set up in the aisle. I saw a flash of annoyance in Caleb's eyes when he saw me, quickly masked by a patronizing smile. "Ah, my father-in-law," he said, his tone indulgent. "I'm so glad you could be here to support our cause." I waited for the murmuring in the room to die down. I looked directly at him, my expression one of simple, paternal pride. And then I spoke, my voice calm and clear, letting the French words roll off my tongue as easily as they had in that workshop in Lyon all those years ago. "Caleb, this is magnificent. It is a gesture of incredible generosity." I saw the first flicker of confusion, then alarm in his eyes. He had gone completely still. Declan and Julian, standing near the stage, exchanged a panicked glance. I continued, my voice level. I was just telling an old friend in Lyon about you. He works in the acquisitions department at the Louvre. Could you tell us which specific wing of the gallery will benefit from tonight's fundraising? The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every eye was on Caleb. His face, which had been flushed with triumph just moments before, had turned a sickly, waxy white. The question was a perfect trap. It was public. It was in French, revealing my secret and shattering his private joke forever. And it was specific, naming a real person and a real institution, giving it the ring of unassailable truth. He couldn't answer, because the foundation was a sham. He couldn't lie, because I had just demonstrated that I would know if he did. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A small, strangled noise escaped his throat. The mask had not just slipped. It had been ripped away, and for one horrifying, endless moment, everyone in that room saw the terrified, fraudulent little man hiding underneath. He finally found his voice, stammering in English, a desperate attempt to regain control. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My father-in-law is confused. But the damage was done. The confidence was gone, replaced by raw, naked panic. I saw the whispers start, the curious, speculative glances being exchanged throughout the room. The foundation of his carefully constructed world had just been shaken to its core. I didn't say another word. I simply gave a small, polite nod, as if his non-answer was perfectly satisfactory, and walked away from the microphone. As I headed for the exit, I passed the table where his associates were sitting. Julian was staring at his plate, his face grim. But Declan was watching me, his expression a mixture of shock, fury, and a dawning, grudging respect. My work for the evening was done. As I pushed open the grand doors of the ballroom, I heard Caleb's voice, strained and cracking, trying to dismiss the incident as a joke. But no one was laughing anymore. The fallout from the gala was not a thunderclap, but a slow, creeping fog of suspicion. My phone did not ring that night. The next morning, a call came from Eliza. She sounded exhausted, her voice hollowed out. She relayed the story Caleb had concocted, that I had suffered some sort of momentary confusion, perhaps brought on by the stress of the evening, that I had misspoken. He had been a model of loving concern, she said, insisting I should see a doctor. He had transformed my attack into an act of pity, painting himself as the patient, caring son-in-law, burdened by his wife's aging, senile father. It was a vicious, clever narrative, and Eliza, desperate to believe in the man she married, had latched onto it. I let her speak, my heart aching for the pain I was causing her, the pain that was necessary to save her from something far worse. The city's society pages handled the incident with practiced discretion. One columnist referred to a poignant, if confusing, family moment that had briefly interrupted the otherwise successful launch of the Ashford Foundation. Another mentioned my heavily accented French question as a curious endnote to the evening. The narrative Caleb was pushing of my confusion was working, at least on the surface. But in the world of high finance, a world built on perception and confidence, such an oddity was a crack in the armor. It was a sign of instability, a hint that not all was as it seemed in the house of Ashford. The whispers, I knew, would be far more damaging than any headline. I pictured investors making quiet phone calls, rivals sniffing for weakness, Caleb had weathered the initial impact, but I had started a tremor that was now radiating outward, unseen, through the foundations of his empire. 3 days after the gala, I received an email from an encrypted, anonymous address. The message was brief and to the point. "I know what you're doing. We should talk." There was no signature, only a time and a place. A small, independent coffee shop on the industrial side of town, far from the gleaming towers of the financial district. I knew instantly who it was from. Declan. He was the pragmatist, the survivor. Julian was a loyal soldier, but Declan was a wolf who ran with the pack only as long as it served him. He had seen the look in Caleb's eyes on that stage. He had seen the panic, the loss of control, and he was making a calculated move to save himself. He was the first rat leaving the sinking ship. The coffee shop smelled of burnt espresso and stale pastries. It was a dim, narrow space with a handful of mismatched tables and chairs, the kind of place people went when they didn't want to be seen. Declan was already there, sitting in a booth at the back, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He looked different without his tailored suit and the armor of corporate confidence. In a simple gray sweater, he looked younger and more human. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable. I sat down opposite him, the worn vinyl of the booth cool against my back. We sat in silence for a long moment, two generals from opposing armies meeting on neutral ground to discuss the terms of surrender. He was the first to speak, his voice low, stripped of its usual bravado. He told me he knew Caleb was in trouble. He didn't know the specifics, only that his partner had become increasingly erratic and secretive over the past 6 months. He talked about missed profit targets, about investments that had soured, about a general air of desperation that had begun to permeate their offices. The gala was merely the public confirmation of a private rot he had sensed for weeks. Declan was not a fool. He knew his own name was tied to Caleb's, that if Caleb went down, he would be dragged down with him. He had come to me not out of a sense of justice, but a sense of self-preservation. He slid a slim, unmarked flash drive across the table. On it, he explained, were the internal financial statements for Caleb's company for the last 2 quarters. They were not the doctored, optimistic reports that were shown to investors. This was the real picture, a grim landscape of mounting debt, dwindling assets, and catastrophic losses. He had made a copy for his own protection, and now he was giving it to me. In return, he wanted only one thing: my assurance that when the time came, his name would be kept out of it. He wanted me to make it clear that he was a victim of Caleb's fraud, not a co-conspirator. I didn't make him any promises. I simply picked up the flash drive, its plastic casing cool in my hand, and nodded. It was all the confirmation he needed. Back in my study, the contents of the flash drive laid Caleb's deceptions bare in the stark, unforgiving language of numbers. It was worse than I had imagined. He wasn't just in debt. He was functionally insolvent. He had been using the foundation as a personal slush fund, funneling money from new investors through the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation to pay off old debts and fund his lavish lifestyle, a classic Ponzi scheme. The painting, the loans, the gala, it was all part of a desperate, frantic dance to keep one step ahead of total collapse. The $100,000 pledge he had made to the art gallery was a bluff, a check he had no intention of ever writing. It was a house of cards, and I now held the proof that could bring it all down in a single gust of wind. This time, the target would not be Caleb alone. The fraud was too extensive, the list of victims too long. His entire network of enablers and investors needed to know the truth. I spent the next 2 days compiling the information into a single, devastating dossier. I included the pawn shop record, the Cayman Islands registration for the foundation, and a summary of the internal financials from Declan's flash drive. I wrote a cover letter, a simple, factual account of Caleb's actions, written in the third person, as if from a concerned whistleblower. I created a list of recipients, every major investor listed in the company's annual report, the board members of the City Art Gallery, and a handful of influential financial journalists I had identified during my research. This was the most painful part of the plan. I knew I could no longer shield Eliza from the truth. To leave her in the dark now would be a cruelty, abandoning her to face the public implosion of her husband's life without any preparation. I had to show her the proof, to break her heart now in order to save her from a far greater devastation later. I called her and asked her to come to my house. I told her it was important that we needed to talk about her mother. The mention of my late wife was the one thing I knew she could not refuse. She arrived that afternoon, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with worry. She had been living in a state of high tension since the gala, and it was taking its toll. We sat in the living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Stacks of books, framed photographs, the faint scent of my wife's favorite potpourri, still lingering after all these years. It was a world away from the cold, sterile perfection of her penthouse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture her. I simply laid the documents out on the coffee table between us, one by one. The pawn record for her mother's painting, the registration for the sham foundation, a simplified chart I had made showing the flow of money into the Cayman accounts and out to Caleb's personal creditors. I watched her face as she read. I saw the initial confusion give way to a dawning, horrified understanding. I saw the denial, the desperate attempt to find an innocent explanation for the damning evidence in front of her. Her hands began to shake as she picked up the pawn shop document, her eyes tracing the description of the painting. Her husband's name. The paltry sum he had received for it. The beautiful, polished story Caleb had told her about the museum exhibition crumbled into dust. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another, and then another. The carefully constructed world she had lived in, the man she thought she had married. It was all a lie. The sound of her quiet sobs was the most difficult thing I had ever had to endure. I let her cry. When the tears finally subsided, she looked up at me, her eyes red and raw, but with a new, hard light in them. The illusion had been shattered, and in its place was a cold, clear-eyed fury that mirrored my own. She did not ask me how I had found all of this. She did not question its authenticity. In her heart, she had known something was wrong for a long time. This was just the confirmation. She straightened her back, her posture no longer that of a frightened, confused wife, but of a woman who had been profoundly wronged. She looked at the stack of documents on the table. "He lied," she whispered, the words small but filled with the weight of a monumental betrayal. "He lied about everything." I had one more thing to show her. I walked to the old wooden chest in the study and retrieved the small velvet box. I brought it back and opened it on the coffee table next to the evidence of Caleb's deceit. The Legion of Honor gleamed in the afternoon light, its red ribbon a stark slash of color against the white paper. I explained to her, for the first time, what it was and why it had been given to me. I told her about a fire in a Lyon apartment building, about 2 children trapped on the top floor, about a choice I had made without thinking. It was a story about honor, about doing the right thing not for applause or recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. It was everything her husband was not. She looked from the metal to my face, and I saw a flicker of the fierce, proud girl she had been before Caleb had entered her life. The spell was broken. She stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. She gathered the documents from the table, her hands no longer shaking. She held the evidence of her husband's fraud, her face set like stone. "I'm going home now," she said, her voice steady. "I need to look for my passport." The implication was clear. She was not just confronting him. She was leaving him. As she walked to the door, she turned back to me, her expression a mixture of profound sadness and newfound strength. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Then she was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet house, knowing the final act was about to begin. After Eliza left, the house was quieter than it had ever been. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a storm. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a man who had just set a demolition charge at the base of a condemned building. The act was necessary, but there was a solemnity to it, a respect for the destruction that was about to be unleashed. I went to my workshop, the scent of cedar and oil a comfort in the charged atmosphere. I didn't work. I sat on my stool, my hands resting on the cool, scarred surface of my workbench. And I waited. I knew the confrontation happening 40 floors above the city would be the primary explosion, the one that would break the foundations. My part, the public demolition, would come shortly after. The call came 2 hours later. It wasn't from Eliza, as I had expected, but from a blocked number. I answered, and a man's voice, tight with panic, spoke my name. It was Julian. He sounded nothing like the cocksure young man from the dinner party. His voice was thin, reedy, stripped of all its arrogance. He was calling from the lobby of Caleb's building. He said there was shouting, the sound of breaking glass. He told me Caleb had locked himself in the penthouse after Eliza had confronted him and left, and that he refused to open the door for anyone. Julian had been summoned by a frantic call from his boss, but now he was helpless, locked out, a loyal soldier with no king to defend. He was begging me to tell him what was going on. I said nothing. I simply listened to his fear, a pale reflection of the terror his mentor was surely feeling. And then I hung up. With Julian's call as confirmation that the fuse was lit, I returned to my study. The dossier I had prepared was open on my computer screen, a tidy package of financial ruin. The email addresses of his investors, the gallery's board members, and the journalists were compiled in a mailing list. It was time. I attached the file, the digital equivalent of a bomb, and took a deep, steadying breath. My hand was firm as I moved the mouse. I hovered the cursor over the send button for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the finality of the act. This was the point of no return. I clicked. There was no sound, no explosion, just a small, silent notification on the screen confirming that the message had been sent. The dominoes had been pushed. Now, all I could do was watch them fall. The first public sign of the collapse came just before midnight. A well-known financial blogger, one of the journalists on my list, posted an article on her website. The headline was stark: "Ashford Capital on brink of collapse amid allegations of fraud." The article was cautious, citing an anonymous source and leaked documents, but the details were explosive. It laid out the shell foundation, the questionable loans, the discrepancies in the financial reports. It was a meticulously sourced piece of journalism, and it spread through the digital world like wildfire. I watched on my computer as other news outlets picked it up, each one adding another layer to the story of Caleb's spectacular downfall. The whispers from the gala had become a roar. The next morning, the story was the lead on every major financial news network. I watched, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, as talking heads dissected Caleb's empire with surgical precision. Stock market analysts pointed to the underlying weakness of his company, something they had apparently suspected all along. Art world commentators expressed their shock and outrage at the deception surrounding the painting and the phony foundation. The City Art Gallery issued a formal statement, a masterpiece of corporate damage control, stating they were deeply concerned by the allegations and had no record of a formal loan agreement with Mr. Ashford. They had cut him loose, erasing him from their history as cleanly as a forger might remove a signature from a stolen painting. By midday, the company's stock, which had been suspended from trading at the opening bell, had become worthless. News cameras were camped outside the gleaming tower that housed Caleb's office, their lenses pointed at the entrance like a firing squad. I saw footage of shell-shocked employees leaving the building, carrying cardboard boxes filled with their personal belongings, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. They were the collateral damage, the innocent bystanders in a war they didn't even know was being fought. I felt a pang of regret for them, but it was quickly replaced by the cold knowledge that their suffering was the direct result of one man's greed and arrogance. Caleb had built his house on a rotten foundation, and now it had collapsed on everyone inside. There was a brief, chaotic scene on the news in the early afternoon. Caleb, flanked by a team of expensive-looking lawyers, attempted to leave the building. He was immediately swarmed by a mob of reporters, their microphones and cameras shoved in his face, their questions a barrage of accusations. He looked like a different man. The tailored suit was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and the confident, predatory smirk was gone, replaced by a hunted, haunted look. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer conceal. He didn't speak. He was bundled into the back of a black SUV by his legal team, a disgraced king fleeing his fallen kingdom. It was the last time I would see him in person, a final, pathetic image of a man utterly destroyed by his own hubris. Later that evening, I saw a report that Julian had been taken in for questioning by federal investigators. His loyalty had been his undoing. He had been so entwined in Caleb's schemes, his signature on so many fraudulent documents, that he could not escape the blast radius. He had tried to be a loyal lieutenant, but he had only succeeded in becoming a co-conspirator. Declan, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. I saw his name mentioned in a few articles, quoting a statement from his lawyer that he was fully cooperating with the authorities, and was as much a victim of Mr. Ashford's deception as the investors. The rat had made it to shore, leaving his captain and the loyal first mate to go down with the ship. The phone rang again around 10 o'clock that night. It was Eliza. Her voice was quiet, but for the first time in years, it was calm. The brittle, anxious edge was gone. She was at a hotel near the airport, She told me she had watched the news all day. She didn't sound sad or angry anymore, just weary, as if she had just woken up from a long and terrible dream. She had done what she needed to do. Her passport was in her purse, and a one-way ticket to Paris was booked for the following morning. She needed to get away, to breathe different air, to remember who she was before she had become Mrs. Caleb Ashford. She told me she would call me when she landed. Before she hung up, she told me about the final confrontation in the penthouse. It had been ugly. He had cycled through a predictable pattern of denial, rage, and finally, pathetic pleading. When he realized she knew everything, that the proof was undeniable, he had begged her to stay, promising he could fix it, that he could get the money back, that they could run away together. He didn't understand that it was never about the money. She had simply looked at him, the stranger in her house, and told him that her mother's painting was worth more than he could ever comprehend. Then she packed a bag and walked out, leaving the sound of him smashing his centerpiece investment to pieces behind her. She had not looked back. I spent the rest of the evening in my workshop. I picked up a piece of unfinished oak, its surface smooth and cool beneath my fingers, and began to work. The familiar rasp of the sandpaper, the sharp, clean scent of the wood. The quiet focus of the craft, it was an anchor in a world that had been thrown into chaos. I thought of the old wooden chest in my study, a thing of substance and memory, built with care and designed to last. It held things of real value. Photographs, a worn book, a medal earned through courage. Caleb had built his life out of smoke and mirrors, a collection of price tags and empty promises. His world had vanished in a day. Mine, built on a foundation of solid wood and honest work, remained. As I worked, I thought about the French words that had started it all. The hic. His peasant hands. Caleb had seen my hands as a sign of weakness, of a lower status. He couldn't understand that these hands, the ones he had mocked, were the source of my strength. They were hands that could build, that could restore, that could hold on to things of value. They were also hands that could patiently, methodically, take his entire world apart, piece by rotten piece. The quiet satisfaction I felt was not the hot thrill of victory, but the calm, deep contentment of a job well done. A project completed, a crooked frame made straight. The laughter was gone, just as I had known it would be. My phone buzzed on the workbench, startling me out of my reverie. It was a text message from an unknown number. My heart tightened for a moment, thinking it might be a last, desperate threat from Caleb. But it wasn't. The message contained only a single photograph and 3 words. The photo was a grainy image, taken from a distance, of my wife's painting. It was hanging in a brightly lit, sterile-looking room, a small inventory tag visible in the corner. It looked undamaged, safe. The 3 words below it were simple. Consider us even. It was from the owner of the Gilded Lion. The old man had kept his word in his own way. He had found the painting in the chaos and secured it. It was a small act of decency in a world of greed, a quiet grace note at the end of a brutal symphony. Just before I turned in for the night, my phone rang one last time. It was Eliza again, her voice clearer now, stronger. She was at her gate at the airport, the sounds of boarding announcements faint in the background. She said she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She was going back to a place of happy memories, to the city where her mother had been so full of life, to find herself again. I told her I was proud of her, and that I loved her. Her reply came back, clear and steady, the words a balm on the raw wounds of the past few weeks. I love you too, Dad. It's over. It's finally over. I'm coming home. And with that, the line went quiet, leaving only the promise of a new beginning. 6 months later, the autumn rains began to fall, washing the city clean. The air grew crisp, and the leaves on the old maple tree outside my workshop window turned to fire. The chaos of Caleb's downfall had long since faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and new outrages. The world has moved on, as it always does. The legal proceedings were a distant, bureaucratic hum. I heard through the news that Caleb had taken a plea deal, accepting a lengthy prison sentence in exchange for his testimony against a wider network of financial criminals. Julian received a much shorter sentence for his cooperation. Their names became footnotes in a story that was no longer mine to tell. The silence they left behind was not empty. It was peaceful. Eliza came home. Not to the city, with its ghosts and its glittering towers, but home to the quiet, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. She didn't return from Paris the same woman who had left. The brittle anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady strength I hadn't seen in her since she was a girl. She rented a small apartment a few blocks away, a cozy space filled with second-hand furniture and plants that thrived in the afternoon sun. She had started taking painting classes again, her fingers stained with cadmium yellow and cerulean blue. Sometimes she would come over in the evenings and we would sit on the porch, drinking tea in the cool air, not needing to say much at all. We were healing together. One Saturday, a large, flat package arrived, delivered by a fine art transport company. Inside, carefully wrapped in layers of acid-free paper, was her mother's painting. I helped the delivery men carry it into the living room, and we leaned it against the wall. The vibrant blues and fiery oranges seemed to drink in the light, as alive and hopeful as I remembered. Eliza and I stood before it for a long time, the silence filled with the weight of its journey. It was more than a painting now. It was a survivor. It was a testament to the things that endure: love, memory, and the fierce, unyielding power of truth. It was a symbol of everything that had been lost and everything that had been reclaimed. We decided not to hang it right away. For a few weeks, it simply rested there, a quiet presence in the house. It felt right, allowing it to reacclimate to a home where it was cherished for its beauty, not its market value. Then, one afternoon, Eliza came over with a hammer and nails. She had found the perfect spot, she said, not in the formal living room, but in the small, sunlit hallway that led to my workshop. It should be somewhere we can see it every day, she explained, a reminder. I held it steady as she hammered the hook into the wall, the clean, sharp sound echoing through the quiet house. We lifted it together, the familiar weight a comfort, and settled it into place. It looked perfect. It looked like it had finally come home. I spend most of my days in my workshop now, just as I always have. The scent of sawdust and wood polish is the same. The tools feel the same in my hands. But something has shifted. The cold, hard knot of resolve that I carried for so long has finally loosened, replaced by a quiet contentment. I look at my hands, the ones my son-in-law so carelessly mocked, and I see the intricate map of a life. I see the hands that held my wife, that raised my daughter, that built a home. They are hands that know the difference between the artificial sheen of a high-gloss finish and the deep, honest glow that comes from polishing a piece of solid wood, working with the grain, not against it. It is a lesson that Caleb, in his world of surfaces and lies, could never comprehend. The other evening, as the sun was setting, I was putting the finishing touches on a small bookshelf, a gift for Eliza's new apartment. It was made of cherry wood, the color of a deep blush wine. As I ran my hand over the smooth, finished surface, I thought of the night it all began, of the cold penthouse and the cruel, careless laughter. The memory no longer brought a sting of anger, only a distant, quiet pity for a man so hollow he had to fill his life with expensive, empty things. He had tried to build an empire of glass and steel, but he had forgotten the most important rule of the craftsman. A structure is only as strong as its foundation. His was built on sand. Mine was built on solid ground. And it was still standing. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to follow for more stories of justice and revenge.